Efficiency and Modernization Advisory Panel. One thing that I need to just provide a mea culpa on upfront, realize that information went out to the panelists, where you were able to start looking at the detail around the submissions, that had come in for efficiency and modernization, and I believe there are 150 of them. So that was a lot of information. Didn't expect everyone to be able to get to and absorb all of that. And so it isn't really necessary for this meeting for that to have happened at a great level of detail. And I will say up front, this is probably, it may not be the hardest of the 5 sessions, but it'll probably be the messiest in the sense that we're at the top of that funnel in terms of idea capture. And we've gotten all the submissions, and based on some of the work that we've done in the last session, begun to put them in the framework against the needs that we'd identified in our last session. And so the goal today is really going to be to just kind of walk through that framework and begin identifying some of the programmatic areas, which is really kind of the altitude we're going to be playing at, to evaluate kind of where we're coming out and where a lot of the energy was certainly an interest from a submission standpoint, as well as thinking back to last time, some of the areas that we wanted to get some more additional information around. And to that end, in a little bit, Merle from KLRD is going to kind of present some top level info around the facilities renovation topic. But that all being said, we're going to go through this, have some really great discussions around each one of the areas of needs, talk about the submissions, get your input on kind of, your insights as to how you look at how things are overlaying at this point. Then spend a little bit of time as well talking about the criteria that we're going to use between this session and the next one to really kind of filter out some of the ideas and begin to weight them and begin to flesh them out more. Before I go into, though, a little bit of the overview and then quickly get into more of a back and forth discussion, I was just wondering, Representative Waymaster or Mark Hutton, would you like to say anything as we kick off?
Oh, no, this is Representative Waymaster, and thank you, John. I was actually finally able to get into the folder, and so I was looking at some of the submissions that we had received for our committee. I think you probably touched on it. We had 140 submissions, and I kind of like the format where it tells you whether it's allowable, not allowable, and at the end, which will help us as we're going through that and filtering through. But just welcome everybody, and let's get started.
Awesome. Mark, are you on the line?
Yes, I'm sorry I tapped in a tad late. I have not had a chance to get into the folder yet. I apologize for that, but I'm excited to get the process going. It seems like it's been a long time coming. So
great. Yeah, and it's a little light reading once you get into the folder, so something to look forward to. I talked a little, go to the next slide. I talked a little bit about, I think I talked a little bit about the general timeline. Go to the next slide. So once again, just to kind of reorient everyone where we are in the process, we're at the second meeting. And here we've gotten all the submissions, worked through the night in order to kind of build them into the framework to understand kind of where they're fitting in against the needs that we'd outlined before. In order to be able to kind of start really beginning to flesh out more of that programmatic level that we want to fly at to evaluate and prioritize. So we're going to have a lot of discussion around that here. Understanding, getting people's perspectives on the areas that are bubbling up, as well as to understand if, are there things that people still think we may be missing? And then close talking about the filtering criteria we'll use to narrow it down a little bit, as well as the next steps around kind of working to add more flesh to the bones around some of those programmatic areas. Go to the next slide. So the next slide is a pretty important one for us to really be able to talk about. And I believe this may have actually been a question in one of your committee meetings. Actually, I represent Waymaster. It's, what's the difference between a program and a project? And the way to think about it is we've been working from the left to the right up until now, identifying within efficiency and modernization, the focus areas, right? And so we talked about those a lot the last time, and even got a little bit of voting around the areas, the focus areas: facilities modernization, IT infrastructure, safety and security, and then identifying what are some of the needs, that fall under each one of those areas. And so here are 4 areas of need that fall under facilities modernization, which then start linking up into programmatic areas. Here are the things that you could do to address those needs. We're also, so we've been working from the left to the right on this to kind of get at that sweet spot we're going to fly at. We're also moving from the right to the left. We've had a lot of project submissions, and those project submissions kind of fall into those programmatic areas. So during, in some cases, these programs are going to look like a grouping of projects, some of which have been submitted, some of which, when we start thinking about the program, may be added. In some cases, the program itself is going to look a lot like a project because it's largely just comprised of one thing. Given the amount of time we have and just the types of setup for the panels, we're not really going to be able to go through procurement around projects specifically in this process. What we're really going to be able to do is prioritize kind of areas of programmatic spend and how much to be able to send to the Spark Committee. We talked about this a little bit the last time, but just wanted to start getting some of that vernacular straight with everyone and just kind of give people a little bit of orientation around what the process we're going through here. Does that make sense? Good. Next slide. And by the way, I'm going through these slides fairly quickly up front because the one piece of consistent exit survey commentary coming out of all the panels was that I should talk as little as possible up front around framing and leave most of the time for discussion around the guts of things. And so we'll try and do that in the session. So the other thing to keep in mind as we go through this is kind of a balancing act with the guiding principles and the allowability rules as we think about the investment parameters. So the Spark Executive Committee put in place guiding principles around how they're going to think about priorities from their level, and we have them kind of laid out on a following slide. At the same time, we also need to be thinking about the allowability guidelines or requirements from the Department of Treasury. And so the implications of that are that we need to have those guiding principles in mind all along, because as recommendations go to the Spark Committee, they're certainly going to have those in mind. But we also need to make sure that we are thinking about allowability. And in some cases, it's very black and white, never allowable, always allowable. In a lot of cases, it's kind of depends upon how you've structured the program itself. And so we are actually, we have experts, particularly from Wood O'Brien's, involved in this process. And they've already done a little bit of weighing in on the individual submissions, and we'll weigh in even more as we go and we build out the programmatic areas to make sure that we really understand, where things stand in terms of allowability. Once again, things will filter out if they would never be allowable. In a lot of cases, it's just going to be a matter of degree in terms of how we think about allowability and how we think about shaping some of these programs. Next slide. So I touched on this, but, once again, on the left-hand side, these are things that are always allowable. Responding to the public health emergency, addressing negative economic impacts of COVID, provide premium pay to essential workers, offset cuts in government services, make investments in certain areas. Not allowable very clearly on the right-hand side, and conditionally allowable are initiatives that offer services or benefits for members of disproportionately impacted communities or sectors, such as populations in qualified census tracts, services addressing health disparities, communities disproportionately impacted by pandemic. There's a lot more detail and nuance around all of this, and that's why we're going to have people who are very experienced in it at a very detailed level, looking at every single one of the submissions and how we craft all the programmatic areas. But just to give you a flavor here, this is kind of where we are here. I think a lot of the things generally, within this panel are largely allowable. This is, could be a much bigger issue for some of the other panels. But certainly there are some things in the submissions that on the face of them look like they probably wouldn't be allowable in a few submissions. And those have already been outlined in what you've seen. But the second balancing act that we need to take into account is the guiding principles for the SPARC Executive Committee. So even as we're thinking about, is it allowable, we should be thinking forward to, how the SPARC Executive Committee is going to be thinking about it, particularly in terms of prioritizing sustainable programs, investments, one-time use of funds. That is something really top of mind for the SPARC Committee. Combined with leverage local and agency funds to maximize use of discretionary funds. So for instance, you saw in the submissions, there is kind of one whole theme around, kind of more local type of submissions. So to the extent that those end up being things that fold up into a program, thinking about those in the context of maybe leveraging local and state funds could be an idea in some of those areas, if that's something that the panel decides upon. And then fostering long-term systemic impact, and just really, what is the scope of the impact? There are some things that may be point solutions. There are some things that may affect all Kansans. So thinking about that, as we think about each one of these programmatic areas. And by the way, we've built that into the templates that we're going to create for each one of the programmatic areas. So as we're defining them out, we're going to have at least some preliminary ratings of all of these things to begin to feed into the eventual scoring that we do, or you do as a panel. Next slide. So with that, let's kind of get into the guts of this in terms of brainstorming around the emerging themes and the idea submissions. Go to the next slide. Just as a super quick reminder, here's the submission form, closed yesterday. I believe we got a total of 758 submissions through that. So certainly an incredible amount of engagement. And a lot of that came in probably in the last 3 or 4 days. So a lot of momentum. Go to the next slide. In terms of thinking about, how those submissions kind of folded into the areas that we talked about last time, facilities modernization, there were 38 submissions that felt like they fit in that area thematically. IT infrastructure, 51 submissions, safety and security, 32. Keep in mind though, cybersecurity is in the IT infrastructure piece, and continuity of operations, 19 submissions. And then each one of these, we have typically 2 to 4 kind of areas of nuance within each one of these that we can go into in more detail. But just to kind of give you an initial feel for kind of where the submissions came in against the things that we talked about in the first meeting. Next slide. So after the slide, we're going to have Merle do a bit of a deep dive on the facilities and modernization piece, just to provide a little bit of extra context, because that was an area that we had some questions as a panel coming out of the last session, and KLR did a tremendous amount of work pulling together a lot of information there. And rather than trying to kind of dump all that on you now, Merle can provide kind of an overview of how that all works. And it'll give us a little time to be able to maybe provide some summary information, as well as we can get you kind of the reams of material that had come back from all the work that KRD did in that area. But generally, I guess the top, before going to Merle, kind of highlighted this a little bit before, but 38 submissions, facilities modernization basically broke down into facilities renovation and enhancements, health and safety upgrades and maintenance, new facilities development. IT infrastructure was both digital government and technical infrastructure. That had 51. Safety and security at 32. That was law enforcement equipment upgrades or replacements, physical security enhancements, and continuity of operations, which had 19, was general kind of equipment and materials replacements, and state workforce and operation support. So before handing it over to Merle, kind of any thoughts or reactions to kind of, even before we get into the detail, kind of, where these things ended up playing out?
I just kind of wanted to focus on, if you go back to slide 6, and we're talking about the use of funds, and then we actually want to have a long-term impact throughout the state, and not an ongoing expense that either the state or another local form of government would need to have an expense later on when these funds are exhausted. So that's one thing that we need to keep in mind. And so I just wanted to reiterate that, because if you go through the submissions that we do have in the modernization and efficiency advisory panel, there are some in there that actually have a long-term fiscal effect. And it's not one-time money. And so we just need to be cognizant of the fact that we want to have a long-term effect for the state and an impact for the citizens, but at the same time, we don't want to have an ongoing expense with those investments.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I could expand on that, I think we've got opportunities to actually reduce the footprint of government with projects, hopefully, where we can.
Yes, we do.
The value that that we bring to our state taxpayers.
Yep. Yeah, and I'd say, it's really up to the panel to decide what it puts forward to the SPARK committee. But, there is a reason why that is the first guiding principle. So when you think about how they're going to be receiving things and evaluating them, that certainly is going to be top of mind for them. Any other thoughts around kind of how things played out on the slide in terms of the submissions and kind of, what ended up where?
John, I just had a general question. I noticed there's a lot of local law enforcement. There were some USD projects. There was some other stuff there. For my clarification, could these also be being requested at the local level from local government funds, or allocations that were given to local cities? Are they submitting multiple applications here, or is this one or the other? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure if in that specific one it is, but there have been instances where we've seen some things and we know that it's in their local plans as well. And so that's something we're going to need to think about, as we go through this, and make sure that we understand kind of where things lay.
Okay, thank you.
This is Joe Mandel. I might sort of follow up that question by asking, just for my own edification, did all units of local government receive ARPA funding, or was it limited to only particular units of local government?
I don't know that. And so I'd ask whether anyone else on the call does.
This is Alicia Johnson-Turner, Deputy Executive Director at the Recovery Office. So all 105 counties received direct allocations. The 10 major metros in Kansas received direct allocations. And then there were 615 what were called non-entitlement units, or basically incorporated cities that got money, but like rural water districts, for example, didn't, and townships did not. So
Thank you.
does that answer?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Well, rather than, I mean, we'll be able to dive into more of the detail and have discussion at that level. But before we dive into the, talking about facilities modernization in more detail, I will now hand it over to Merle, who has agreed to kind of walk through kind of the high level, I guess, context and situation there.
Yeah, thanks, John. Just want to make sure everybody can hear me. If anybody wants to give me a thumbs up, that would be appreciate that.
Yep.
My name is Merle Riedel. I am a fiscal analyst with the Kansas Legislative Research Department. So some of the faces I'm seeing in this Zoom today are very familiar, but some new faces. So that's nice to see, and I'm glad to be here. Sounds like this advisory group will be dealing with a lot of facilities modernization, or perhaps another word might be for capital improvements. Sounds like you have a lot of proposals to look through there. So I was asked to come here today to kind of talk through at least the method that the legislature, or specifically the Joint Committee on State Building Construction, the method that they use to kind of look through some of the capital improvement plans for the state. And this would really be capital improvement plans related to about 27 state agencies. And so we'll go ahead and we'll go into it. If I could get the next slide, please. So just briefly, that Joint Committee on State Building Construction that was established pursuant to KSA 461701. It's composed of 10 members. It's been in existence since about the 1970s. 10 members, 5 members from the House and 5 members of the Senate. They have various duties that are defined in statute, but kind of key among those duties is to review and make recommendations to the Senate Committee on Ways and Means, House Committee on Appropriations regarding really kind of 2 items. So the first item is agency 5-year capital improvement plans, or CIPs. And then the other item that they take a close look is the agency annual capital improvement requests. So when we think of the 5-year capital improvement plan, that really is a bit more based on forecasting capital improvement needs for the agencies in the future. And then when we talk about the agency annual capital improvement budget request, that's part of the standard annual budgeting process. So each agency requests funding in the budget year. And for some of these agencies, these include capital improvement programs. Typically, that 5-year plan gets more specific and gets more solidified as we get to the current year. The agency capital improvement requests, those are usually pretty locked in plans because they are for the next 2 fiscal years. Next slide, please. So when we talk about capital improvements, at least how they relate to state government and to the Joint Committee, we're really talking about expenditures that can include new construction, remodeling of existing structures, acquisitions, raising or demolishing structures, rehabilitation and repair, and debt service. You'll see the words rehabilitation and repair quite frequently. And I'm not positive if you've all received a copy of we shared copies of many of the agency's 5-year capital improvement plans. They're quite lengthy and large documents. But in those documents, you would see reference to rehabilitation and repair. And you can think of that as sort of the standard maintenance of buildings. So these are addressing sort of immediate issues like leaking pipes or repairing windows. Some categories can get more advanced, and you'll hear the words deferred maintenance. Those usually apply to expenditures that require some sort of engineering services or some longer term planning involved in those. So those are kind of the big categories for capital improvements. That's what we mean when we say capital improvements. So some of the factors, I sit in on a lot of these hearings, and some of the factors that I often hear agencies discussing as factors that impact their ability to identify projects. It's often based on severity or urgency of need. So some projects that would involve safety concerns or public health issues might rise to the top of their priority list. There are other ways that they prioritize might be based on particular policy initiatives. So capital improvements that would support a particular policy issue might rise to the top if that's the need of the agency. Much of it depends on the available resources. So agencies, you'll see that capital, the 5-year plan, they sort of plan out and schedule these and schedule capital improvement projects so that they can sort of stay within a budgetary limit. So they're not attempting to address all capital improvement projects in 2 years, but may spread those out. Sometimes a particular project may take 2 or 3 years to address. And I think the available resource is interesting here because in those capital improvement plans, 5-year plans that they submit, many of those for this year were not necessarily based on the idea that there was going to be $1.6 billion in COVID-19 federal relief funds. So for many of these agencies, they may have new ideas or new potential capital improvement projects because they realize that there may be some additional resources available. Other factors that would influence their capital improvement project development would be costs. I can tell you in many of the hearings within the last year, there has been some projects that get deferred because of increasing construction costs at the current moment. And then there is also considerations about the capacity to execute. So many of these capital improvement projects are planned and managed by capital improvement individuals within the agencies. And so they may have only a limited ability to address multiple issues in 1 year. So that's some of the capital improvements defined. We'll move on to the next slide. Just want to talk a little bit about the capital improvement cycle for the legislature, and particularly for the Joint Committee on State Building Construction. On July 1st of each year, agencies submit that 5-year capital improvement plan. They submit that to the Joint Committee on State Building Construction. They submit the same plan to the Division of the Budget and to the State Building Advisory Commission. Usually in September and from September to November, the Joint Committee on State Building Construction conducts hearings with each of these agencies. The agencies are actually invited to come to the State House and to review their capital improvement plan with that committee. And those hearings can take anywhere from 10 minutes with smaller agencies, and with larger agencies, it can take 30 to 45 minutes to review those. So that committee hears those capital improvement plans. They either accept them or ask agencies to reconsider certain matters or recommend to adjust other matters. So sort of at the same time, by October 1st, agencies are submitting their annual budget requests. So you kind of got 2 efforts going on at the same time. And their annual budget request for the next 2 fiscal years. And that would include their capital improvement budget. They submit that to the Division of Budget and to KLRD. In January, the governor issues the governor's budget recommendation. And mostly in the month of February, the legislative committees, including the Joint Committee on State Building Construction, then conduct additional hearings with the agencies, but that focuses on their budget requests. So those are more detailed and sort of more exact in what the agencies plan to do in the next 2 years. So that's a brief review of kind of that cycle for the capital improvements. Next slide, please. Just wanted to share, so this is an example of some of the documents that that committee would be looking at, and I apologize, this is not the easiest to read, but this is what's called a DA 418 Alpha or 418A. And this is a summary of a 5-year summary. So you can see along the left, they'll list, and I'm not trying to advocate for the Department of Corrections, but that's the one I work with the most. And so they had a good example to use. So you'll see the agency along the left, and then they'll list all the projects they may have planned for the next 2 years. To the column just to the right of that, you'll see an overall estimated amount that project may require. And then the columns to the right of that, you'll see that they have scheduled those projects out for the next 5 years. And so sometimes you'll see those projects may shift when they come the next year. It may be that a project has moved up in priority, so it's moved up in time and space, or it's gone down in priority, and that can be impacted for a variety of factors. So you'll see that's sort of a quick summary of the 418 Alpha, and this provides overall summary for the agency. And if we go to the next slide, Agencies also, as part of this, so you could think of this as sort of an annex for each one of those projects that they listed on the left. They provide a project request explanation. So this is sort of a one-pager that goes into more detail on each of those projects. Really kind of lists out how they came to the determination of some of those costs. Next slide, please. This is called the Joint Committee on State Building Construction Report. So what you saw were documents that were part of the 5-year capital improvement plan. Those are heard during the interim. This is the sort of the end result for this committee during the budgeting process. So this focuses again on just the next 2 fiscal years. Agencies conduct their hearings, the committee makes its recommendations, and this is the report that's produced. There's usually a multi-page report, but this sort of lists out what the agency has requested, what the governor is recommending for that agency, and eventually what the Joint Committee on State Building Construction is recommending. And again, that recommendation is really targeted towards Senate Committee on Ways and Means and House Appropriations. Next slide, please. I think that kind of wraps me up. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions or clarify any matters, but I'm certainly willing to stand for questions.
So just a point of clarification, this is Mark Hutton. Does the Joint Committee on State Buildings and Construction approve or have any say in these Spark suggestions?
No, the Joint Committee on State Building Construction is not an intervention point in the Spark advisory panel.
I'm just trying to figure out where your part of the presentation meshes in with what we've got to do. Maybe you need to clarify that for me.
Yeah, so I think you'll be looking at several capital improvement projects. And as I understand, the committee was just wanting to learn some context about how capital improvement projects are considered within state government.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Mark, I think in the last session, I think a little bit this was, I seem to remember you wondering, are we doing a lot of the planning, and correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, it was, when we're thinking about facilities improvements and even facilities, just footprint optimization, are we doing it in kind of narrow context as opposed to thinking about it with an integrated view? But if that didn't capture what you were getting at before, correct me.
Yeah, Noel, I served a 4-year sentence on the Joint Committee for State Buildings and Construction. So I'm very familiar with what they do, and I'm not too sure kind of where in the conversation or wires might have gotten crossed, but that's okay. I mean, we don't need to kill any more time with this, and I'm fine with it. Thanks.
Great. Anything else, or should we dive into this deep dive on facilities modernization?
John, I got a question. When we look at the budgets and we look at the Spark recommendations, and probably some of these show up on both lists. So who decides where it goes, or how does that process work at that point?
Well, we certainly don't want it to go in both places. I haven't thought through which one would take precedence.
Okay.
I can tell you, Senator Fagg, I can tell you in the Joint Building Committee, the agencies and the committee is well aware of the Spark Task Force, and there has been occasions where a project seemed like it might be suitable for funding from ARPA. And typically that has resulted in the committee essentially making a recommendation that the agency pursue funding through Spark. So I can't tell you on what the sort of definitive answer is, but I know that the method that's kind of been adopted by the committee is to perhaps recommend an agency pursue funding, but it's really to leave that process to the Spark Task Force.
I could add an example there for facilities maintenance as far as the Department of Administration. So I would be requesting a rehab and repair fund, just a general allocation for maintenance as Merle's described. One of those projects might be some air handler replacements. So if I've requested through the Spark process and the application process to repair air handlers, it may be those general fund rehab and repair allocations could be spent on something like windows or a roof or something else. It's how do we redistribute those within our agency if we find additional resources, if that makes sense.
Great. Well, let's dive into the next slide on facilities modernization. So this is deep diving into every one of those 4 areas. And so going into a little bit more detail and providing a little bit more context around the submissions and kind of how they're starting to flesh out programmatic areas. So in each one of these 4 slides, what we're going to want to test is, what's missing? Have we missed any needs? Right? Because this is the framework that we're using. 2, how well do those programmatic areas cover the needs? So we defined some programmatic areas, gave an example of a sample submission or 2 that would have been in there, gave an idea of the number of submissions. So we can start looking at it and saying, like, are we really covering the landscape fully here? And then generally kind of what surprises you about the submissions? Are there any gaps? To the extent you've had a chance to go through the submissions, are there either any gaps in the needs, the programmatic areas, or there, if you've looked at the submissions, are there some things you're expecting to see that you expect to see? Are there some things that you saw that were different than what you're expecting to see? If you have any kind of initial thoughts around whether the submissions align with the Spark guiding principles, specifically that's starting to get at what Representative Waymaster was talking about of, well, some of them look like they involve ongoing expense, identifying those and thinking about how the panel wants to address those is going to be an important topic for the panel. And then against, any one of these areas within facilities modernization, or some areas to really think about things maybe in a more of a transformative way. So a lot of the submissions may have just been kind of standard course of business per se. Are there things that in any one of these kind of focus areas, we may want to really try and think about that maybe a little bit more transformative. So with that, I'll just, rather than trying to kind of like walk through and talk through the 3 areas of needs and, all the programmatic areas, let you take a look at it for maybe a minute. And then, let's just open up to discussion for a while to kind of talk about this area and how we feel about it. Any thoughts? First one who talks gets to like set the course of the conversation. So.
Well, I'll say something. This is Joe. I just, you got the questions on the side there. This isn't my area of expertise necessarily. So I don't know that I would know if something was missing or how well the programmatic areas might cover each need. But I will, to sort of pull on the thread that was pointed out earlier, I was a little surprised by the number of local submissions in particularly in this area, and facilities modernization, things, from cities or local government to do new buildings, and those kinds of things, knowing, as I had thought, that there were funds sent directly to either municipalities or counties. I was a little surprised by that, to answer that third question there.
Yeah, a lot of the new facilities development, those submissions were more local in nature. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Mark Hutton. If I remember kind of part of the charge, that our focus was to be on state government and state facilities. Am I remembering that correctly? Or because I'm looking at a lot of the brought up earlier, the submittals for development of community centers, city halls, etc. Not sure that those fit very well in that scenario, if that's, in fact, if I'm remembering that right.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and answer that, John. Yeah, you're correct, Mark. We were looking more at statewide benefits or programs or projects that would have a systemic statewide effect. If we start, and I'll just kind of make this comment, if we start looking at certain cities that submitted a proposal for a new city hall, then theoretically we should be building a new city hall for every city in the state of Kansas. And I think the other question was posed, the cities and the counties received the money. There are two things that may have happened. I seriously doubt that the cities or counties have exhausted all the funds that they received through the federal government, but that could be the case. The other is that they are trying to leverage their funds and they're going through the state process as opposed to going through the city or the county. So that would free up their money to use elsewhere. So if we're going to be looking at things on a local level, we have to be aware that that may be the case. But Mark, you're correct. At the very first meeting we had, we said that our focus was going to be on a statewide system.
Okay, thank you.
Any other thoughts? I think that previous discussion was a great point. Once again, if the panel, if it wanted to, could decide to focus us on things that weren't purely state in terms of maybe a way to be able to help kind of leverage other sets of funds, but it's totally up to the panel.
I guess if there's no precedent where the state would typically give money for that type of project, then why would we be considering that?
Yeah.
In this case, if we're considering the state fund, state use, public use, I guess I'm glad Representative Waymaster gave a clarification, because that was kind of spinning in my head too. That was my recollection of our first meeting when we were talking about state use funds. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. Anything else before we move on from this area? Mark, I will say the last time we talked, you had some thoughts around, are we optimizing when we think about facilities renovation and then even just facilities utilization? Are we thinking about that? I just want to make sure I don't lose that from the last time, or I may just be dreaming.
No, especially, that conversation came more from my, when I had my Board of Regents hat on,
Mhm.
related to efficiency of our building use. I believe it's probably prevalent across our state as well, but at our universities, we're not utilizing our buildings at the level we should be. And so, I mean, we keep building new buildings and we don't tear anything down. So it just keeps absorbing into the system, which increases our deferred maintenance as well as utility expenses, and just there's a lot wrapped around that. And I know I haven't seen it here, but I know that Board of Regents submitted a Spark request for a demolition fund. Nobody wants to give money to tear a building down. And so I think the idea was to submit it for a demolition fund that would allow our universities to take some of our older buildings that are in rough shape, just take them out of service and drop them so that we're not throwing good money after bad. So I don't know if that hits on what you're talking about or not, John. But.
I just want to make sure, I mean, it's up to the panel to decide, what areas, needs to focus on, programmatic areas to consider. They don't all have to have come from submissions, right? The panel could decide itself. So I guess at some point, think about whether you think any potential programmatic area focus is missing, and we can certainly add it and continue to push it through the process to think about and flesh out a little more, or not. So I'm content neutral on this stuff. So.
John, one other question or comment was that first section there. It says redesign of current workspaces to meet challenging and increased needs. Does that fall more under efficiency, business practices? Is this spreading people out? I mean, what really defines that? I mean, am I wanting to renovate my office? Does that qualify? I mean, is there further explanation as to what?
I'm trying to, I'll describe what I think it is, having looked through a few of the submissions. I think it may have been there even some new requirements based on COVID in needing to keep people at a distance, or but anyone who's been diving more deeply into the submissions, speak up and let us know kind of some of the nature of some of the things that you fell into that.
John, something I might add to this, whenever, let's say we get a state building and they want a new HVAC and they give us good reasons for that. Do we ever do an energy audit? Because I'm thinking, let's say they ask for an HVAC and you realize that they've got bad windows, just for an example, to where maybe that didn't get on the request. Does that get marked off because it wasn't on the request? Just looking to be efficient in what we're doing. Just a thought.
Yeah, I really don't know. Are we thinking about energy efficiency holistically? Yeah. I guess the question on that one would be to whether you think about it as a programmatic area or not, right?
Well, the other thing I'm questioning, if they didn't have it on their application, can we consider it? So that crosses my mind too.
Yep. Okay. All right. Are we ready to move on from this one? So IT infrastructure, and once again, same approach. Why don't you take a look at it and kind of read through it? Fell into digital government technical infrastructure with a couple of areas under each, and some samples. I mean, I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to read through what we have here and kind of get your thoughts for discussion.
I guess I have a question, John. In some of the like local police departments and sheriff's departments had requested some like new radios. Is that all included in this, or is that in a different section, like public safety?
I think that is in public. I don't think that's
Okay.
here.
Okay, because it kind of fits in with IT, but it's actually a you know, law enforcement asking for it. So I didn't.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, but I don't think it was here.
Included in the law enforcement.
It was in law
safety and
enforcement, yeah.
security section,
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah. The one thing I will say about this particular area, when you think about things that could be catalytic investments, but also touch, you know, many, if not all Kansans in some way or another, probably a lot of these things, or some of them might fit that bill.
This is Joe. I guess I would question whether cybersecurity really belongs underneath digital government or whether it's its own area of need.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I would ask, you know, maybe what was the reasoning or the thought process for placing cybersecurity under digital government?
I think it was just a call that was made to begin providing some structure around some of these. I mean, I think we probably can pull it out unless there's, and make it its own thing.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, at least, I think that would make a little more sense. Cybersecurity sort of spans technical infrastructure, digital government, all the rest of them. It's not really a thing that would be nested under just that.
Okay.
When we're talking about courtrooms, we're talking about state courtrooms too. We wouldn't be local stuff, would we? Kind of back to what was discussed earlier. You know, where one county's taking care of an issue where another one hasn't.
Oh, by the way, cybersecurity is specifically allowable in the ARPA guidance, just as an update. In terms of it, I'm not exactly sure whether every single submission was state, but it sounds like the panel itself can decide, you know, where it really wants to focus in its efforts. So.
And I can touch on that because I was looking at the submissions. It looks like it was submitted by the judicial branch itself, because in their submissions, they're talking about the digitization of the courtrooms, and the judicial branch has state employees or employees in every courthouse across the state of Kansas. And so they're probably looking at doing that for the courtrooms across the state. That's all included in their budget.
Yeah. Because it's in their budget, does that mean that it counts really as a state?
No, when I don't mean to confuse things, but when I said that it's included in their budget, not the digitization of the courtrooms, that's included in with the panel, but some line items in their budget are directly affixed to county courthouses and the courts that go on, the court proceedings that go on in the county courthouses. That's what I meant, not
Okay, got it.
the digitization. No.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this area?
I guess one question about when you change processes to, say, a digitization government process, in that request, does that include the training that would go along to train these folks in this new process, future upgrades and software? Are we talking about a one-time investment? Or are we talking, how does that look from a structural standpoint?
Well,
What would qualify?
I think it would need to be whatever was in the submission. I mean, I think that the panel itself could decide, here are the things to take into account, as that entire program gets packaged. But I think you'd want to try and capture the one time. You certainly wouldn't want to approve things without having an understanding of all of the cost implications of what you're approving. So
Right.
you probably would look at it comprehensively.
Okay. Thank you.
Question is when we had talked last time about, and I kind of got lost in the submissions as well, talked last time about rethinking about the kind of public facing websites across the agencies and the platform there. Was that in, interoperability of government network systems of monitoring, or digitization of government processes?
I would consider that part of digitization of government processes. Unless you want to separate internal and external, digitization can include both internal and external processes.
Okay,
I'm in agreement with Joe on that one.
got it. All right. I'm going to move on to the next one unless anyone has any additional thoughts. All right, next slide, safety and security. Once again, I'll let you guys take a look at it. Yeah, under the law enforcement, this is where a lot of that equipment, including the radio modernization, ended up getting grouped, and then physical security enhancements. And there were a lot of submissions around law enforcement equipment, although I think they were very similar submissions. A number of them were.
The only thing that I would comment on for the panel, and actually Kathy Wolfmore is in my office as well. We were kind of discussing this while I was muted. But this would be where the advisory panel, I think, would have a serious discussion, because we did receive some submissions from, like I mentioned before, with the radios from local police departments and sheriff's departments. And maybe this is, I think Frank mentioned it earlier, or maybe it was Joe, that maybe we look at a grant system where we put a certain amount of money in and have a state agency distribute that, have a submission process, let all of the counties and cities apply for that. And that'd be part of the discussion if we want to address this, because as just Kathy and I were talking, yeah, we have some cities and some counties that have submitted some submissions, but one, have they utilized all the funds that that particular city or county had received? And two, if we do it for them, we have to pretty much do it for everybody. There's an equity issue there, and that's something we'll have to discuss when we start going through the submissions.
Any other thoughts?
I might, it looks like, just going through these, and I have not gone through them in detail, there are a lot of local law enforcement agencies that have submitted for radios in particular.
Yep.
And it seems to me that a lot of the radio requests are being driven by the CISA, the new CISA requirement for AES encryption on radio systems. So there is there seems to be, at least from first glance, to be a common denominator there.
Mhm.
That such a program that is being suggested could be tied to
Mhm.
as a sort of an overarching driver to say, you know, because of that sort of requirement being driven by the feds, you know, this amount is being provided as a bucket for locals to sort of apply to if these conditions are met.
Mhm. Okay, good point.
John, if I could hop in here really quickly, again, Alicia Johnson Turner with the Recovery Office. To Representative Waymaster's point, I think one of the things that we've heard over and over from the Spark Executive Committee when it comes to local dollars is having some local skin in the game, if you will, and the possibility of including a match in a program like that, given that many of these communities also got their own funds. So just something I wanted to throw out is something that they've talked about before that might be an option.
Sure. Great, thanks a lot.
This is Mike Fag, and I might add to that, just for thought process. You're going to have some smaller communities that getting new radios would be a really big deal in their budgets versus somebody that it would be an enhancement, but they could afford it somewhere else. And I don't know how you do that. They're trying to help rural America with some of that. Just a thought.
Sure. Yeah, good point. All right. Good points on all around on this. Let's go to the next one, and continuity of operations. Let you guys take a look at it. This one had a lot of kind of different things in it. You know, and they kind of roughly group this way. But you see kind of more texture when you actually get into the submissions on some of these. Any thoughts on these ones?
Well, I kind of want to make a comment about the state workforce operations and support. And I'll be completely honest, this makes me a little nervous because even though it's asking for like temporary core personnel or staff support to meet surging claims, when we do the budget process on the state side, that's been requested, and then those positions never go away. And so that ends up being a long-term item that we have to spend money on. And so I don't think that meets the purpose of a initial investment that's going to have a long-term result, because this will have a long-term result. Yeah, it will have a long financial one. And so I think this one we have to tread very lightly when we start looking at adding staff.
Good point. Any other thoughts? All right, well, with that, before we get into beginning to kind of preview filtering and some of the topic prioritization, go to the next slide and the slide after that. The one other point that was pretty ubiquitous on all the exit surveys, other than me not talking as much outside of getting into the details at the start, was to give people breaks. So why doesn't everyone take a little bit of a break for the next 5 minutes or so? Kind of recharge, catch up on your emails or whatever, and then at 5:10 or so, let's get started again. Whoever's managing the slides, move it to slide 18 for when we kind of come out of the break. I think the next best place to talk would probably be around the filtering. Oh, sorry, it's repaginated. Go to the slide with the filter on it. My favorite slide. Keep going, right there. Thanks. Nope. Back up. Back up. Okay. Great. Once again, my favorite slide. We always have to go to the slide at one point. So. All right, how about we get started up in about another minute? All right. Everyone good to get started again? So kind of what I just did was I kind of skipped over, at least for now, that exercise that we used on the collaboration board last time. I'll revisit it at the end if we want to. We can go through the exercise again of, just checking that framework around the focus areas, the needs, and the programmatic areas, just to make sure that we've captured everything and maybe even understand where people see the most opportunity. But the one thing, since we've been talking about filtering and maybe even beginning to talk about prioritizing, I want to go through kind of a couple slides here that I think could be a pretty good discussion. So the first one, and I keep saying this is my favorite slide because I was the one who drew it originally. But anyway, this is kind of the where are you in the process slide for each one of the panels around getting as many ideas as we can at the top of the funnel. And ironically, at the time, all these numbers were illustrative. We said, say, 200. And we probably ended up with about 180 ideas per panel. But then going through the filtering stage and just filtering out the ones that, are things that as a panel don't want to go into in detail around fleshing them out more because they're non-starters for one reason or another. I've already done that a little bit with some of the things that just could never fit within the ARPA guidelines, right? And then we would go through, we go through a period of time between this meeting and the next, fleshing out those programmatic areas and thinking about, well, what might make some of them allowable where it's a perhaps, and beginning to understand, framing what the impact and feasibility of some of these areas are. Then go through a prioritization exercise, and then finally kind of the panel putting together the portfolio. But go to the next slide, because we've already started having some discussions around the points on the next slide, which is really, okay, let's talk about the filtering lens. Is it allowable? Can we use, this source of funds for this type of a area? And if it's a no, then clearly it should be out. If it's a yes, it can be in. If it's an unclear, we're going to need to maybe even figure out how, what criteria would make it allowable, how it might be able to be shaped. But we were talking about some other things just now. And I'm kind of curious to have a discussion around whether we want to just use it as a filter or we want to, think about it in terms of, okay, it's something where we'd eventually weight it in the end. So for instance, alternative funding, can we fund with, non-ARPA dollars, are there existing programs, the investment type, is it a one-time or an ongoing investment? What's the scale of the funding? Is this just kind of a point solution? Is it something that's more local? And so we might want to think about it differently, but, do we want to think about potentially filtering them out if they're local, unless they meet certain criteria? So, I guess have at it in terms of that discussion.
So John, on the spreadsheet, when it says to be completed in the allowability section,
Yeah.
is that we're still filtering through and seeing whether or not that would be accepted under the definitions from the U.S. Treasury, or are we waiting on information from the submitter? I'm just kind of wondering when it says to be completed.
Yeah, my guess is that was probably Widow O'Brien's not having the time to complete it, either because it was something novel that they hadn't seen before and they wanted to investigate it a little more, or they had some follow-up questions. If anyone from the support team can provide any elaboration around that, let me know, but that's how I interpret it.
Happy to correct. There was a significant number of submissions that came in right around the deadline. And so they have not gone through the full list of processing. You will find an updated version on Teams as they complete the final review.
And when will those updates be made? Do you have a time frame?
Expect that all of the submissions that came in before 5 p.m. tomorrow will be tagged by the end of the day tomorrow.
All right, thank you.
This is Joe. Do we have a process outlined for those that are labeled somewhat allowable or potentially not allowable to determine allowability there, or are we going to go back to the submitter and ask questions? Is there some process for that?
I think it's going to depend. I mean, once again, once we group it up into program areas, it becomes a little bit more of a question at the program level around those types of things. Yeah, but we're going to have to go back and eventually be able to make a call on that through some combination of looking at them in more detail. And that's where, Widow O'Brien would be spending a lot of time, as well as asking for some clarification. Just keep in mind on a lot of these, just so many things came in at the last second that they just haven't had the ability to kind of look at them all, the level of detail that they eventually will. There were just some, though, that clearly on the face of it would always be allowable, and some that clearly on the face of it would not be, right? So it was easier for them to put things to each one of those. The ones in the middle, just take a little bit more thought, time, and research.
So at the end of the day, you're going to determine with your crew as to whether it's allowable or not, and the ones that are tagged potentially or likely will be moved into either yes or no's, or is that open for discussion?
I think they're going to need to be moved into yes or no, but with some criteria around what it takes to get to a yes.
So part of that, we need to know kind of why it's a potential no, don't we?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or what would make it a potential yes.
John, this is Matt Hansen with Widow O'Brien's, and yes, the ones that are still to be determined were the 300 or so that came in yesterday afternoon. We have gone through them all now, so you should get updates soon. As far as the somewhat allowable, some of it has to do with proposals that had multiple activities. So it might be, cybersecurity controls and to construct a building, or disparate items in a single proposal where a piece of it is allowable but a piece of it's not allowable. So depending on how projects get rolled up and become programs, if pieces that are potentially unallowable are included, that's when we'll work with the applicants to determine that. So it's just a step one in what will be a multiple step process.
Okay, so the key element that you just said there is what I was looking for, is that you will be talking to the applicants to make sure we have a full understanding of their intention, and so we don't just summarily discharge them or put something through that shouldn't.
Yeah, we're not just gonna arbitrarily rule somebody out, and we will work with people, to get to yes whenever we possibly can.
All right, thank you.
So I guess one of the questions is, and I guess, could you flip to the slide that is the program template? So just to kind of jump ahead a little bit, one of the things that we want to be able to work with the panelists on, with the support team putting in, the bulk of the effort around this, but need to get some partnership, particularly around those key discussion questions in the bottom left, is beginning to build what these programs look like, right? Working back from the projects and working forward from the needs. And so beginning to just really crystallize the description of what we need, the goals, the target outcomes. Eventually, we're going to need to get to a target ask and a minimum viable ask, depending upon how much we group into the program, right? Looking at the projects that are in it, and which ones may make sense or not, but just getting kind of a feel for that. But then also being able to identify kind of things that are going to be important when it comes to scoring these programs against each other in terms of, impact, equity, feasibility, do other funding sources or programs exist, financial sustainability, some example projects of what would be in there, any allowability concerns, for instance, for this particular type of idea, does it need to disproportionately impacted communities? What does that mean? Does it have interdependencies with any of the other items? So just kind of jumping forward, as we're building these programs out, and we want to build these out between this meeting and the next, one of the things that's going to come in the exit survey is, hey, which programs would you be willing to kind of interact with some of the support team on, mainly to talk about those questions on the left, so not a heavy lift, but really beginning to kind of engage around a few of the programmatic areas. But this is kind of what we're aiming for generally, in order to be really crisp about what we're talking about in each one of these areas, and begin to start profiling on them on things that will allow us, or the panel really, to be able to make some trade-offs. I mean, hopefully it helped jumping forward to this, but this is kind of how we're going to start building, all of these components into a framework that will allow the panel to be able to make some decisions. Does that make sense? Was that a helpful preview?
Makes sense to me. John, could I suggest that we add a unique identifier to each one of these, whether it's something, so when we start talking about these, we know everybody's kind of on the same page and looking at the same one?
Yeah, good call. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll do. I've kind of jumped all around, but going back to kind of the filtering criteria, and I'd ask, the chairs, we've talked about how do we think about local asks? How do we think about, things that would require ongoing investments? Are those things that we want to consider as hard filters, or are those things that we want to kind of weight as we look at the programs versus each other? Or you want to?
Yeah, for me, on any ongoing costs or incurrence of other responsibilities related to this would be a non-starter for me. As far as it relates to local governments and the like, I'd wait to hear what the other committee members kind of thought of that, and I do think we'd have to put some restrictions on where the matching funds came from, because all that could do sometimes is just create another hole someplace else. I've seen that happen too.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Hi, this is Kathy. Oh, wait a second. I think I'm echoing, sorry. I would agree with Mark Hutton about the, anything that has ongoing costs. I think that's what we don't want to do, in my opinion, but I would want to leave the door open on local, any kind of local requests. We don't know how this process is going to go, so I don't want to firmly shut the door on that one yet. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other thoughts?
John, I had another question. This is Frank. One thing I haven't seen, unless I missed it, was a plan for executing the request, the timeline. Can you reaffirm? I think it's 2026 is when these funds have to be expended, especially when you start talking about other parties contributing funds or executing the project. Is there anything that's part of this vetting process or application process that can assure us that if it's awarded, it can be done in the time frame?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Once again, keep in mind that even though the submissions are largely projects, we're talking really more about programmatic areas that they're going to fall into, and we can make those requirements of the programmatic areas as you know, in terms of what projects would qualify. But yeah, you're right. There is a time limit around when the funding needs to be utilized by. So that's a good call.
And the only thing I'd make a comment about in regards to the local forms of government that have submitted items for us to consider, as I kind of mentioned before, we need to be looking at a statewide level first. And then if we do want to address some of the applications that were submitted by local forms of government, I think, you know, it was mentioned before that there were some sheriff's departments or police departments that were referencing the same radio type. So maybe we set up a block grant to address and have that be administered that way to help the locals. That, again, I'll mention it, we have an equity issue if we start doing one county and not another. And then they're potentially, they could be upset because they didn't submit a form and they didn't get funding. So we got to be careful with the local forms of government. I mean, for example, I have 4 or 5 communities that submitted stuff to our advisory panel, and I'm making comments right now that sounds like I would turn them down. And I would have to explain to them that there's this equity issue that we have to address. And that's why we need to have the main focus be statewide.
I think another area that we need to examine is whether or not we're going to engage private entities. I notice it appears that there's, you know, a number of private organizations that have requested funding for various things, and I'm not sure that fits in our between our guardrails of the marching orders that said we're to focus on state government, but just making that comment, unless I something.
When I scanned through fairly quickly, and correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone looked at it in more detail, it looked like it was IT consultants that were basically almost proposing projects. And so it's almost like the program itself might be hitting that area, but you know, that would be kind of a detail around the program in terms of who you used to execute it. Am I thinking about it correctly?
Well, I can't, I haven't had a chance to read into any of this yet much, but I guess it depends on how they've structured it. I get the impression that they're looking for work. So.
Yeah, but they've identified it against some of these thematic areas. So, you know, that's the difference between thinking about, you know, this isn't going through the procurement project, the procurement cycle, right? This is identifying an area of spend. And so it could be they end up doing a project if it's an area of need with one of them, maybe, but maybe not.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, but they don't identify a state agency
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
around that proposal.
Yeah.
So I don't know how we would determine who would get, I mean, I guess if it's a good idea, we'll figure out where we can give some money to it. And then they can go out for an RFP. Is that what you're saying, John?
If it's an area that's highlighted, potentially, yeah. I don't know, Joe, you just nodded. So,
Yeah, I share the concern. I don't see a position to grant dollars or provide dollars directly to one of those, if they're IT consultants, like you're saying, and then have them shop that around to state
Yeah.
agencies or even local forms
Yeah.
of government. That just seems kind of backwards to me.
yeah.
Joe said kind of exactly what I was going to say, because I'm looking at it right now, and there's one that is referencing, rural cities and first responders, and it sounds like they're like Mark said, they're wanting a job. So
Yeah.
I think we'll have to be very cautious, and I'd probably even go to the statement of saying probably not even consider those. Because even on the allowability, on the one I'm looking at, it says potentially not allowable. So, I mean, a lot of those have already been defined as maybe not allowed for the ARPA funds.
Yep. Great. All right. Well, lots of useful feedback in terms of this. Let me kind of continue to kind of walk down. So go to the next slide. And I don't know, I'm going to skip going through using that collaboration board again, unless people want to go through the same exercise that we did last time with the kind of tiles to make sure we have all the areas covered. But I think we may have gotten that from the discussion that we did on the deep dives. But if anyone thinks differently, we can certainly go back and do that exercise.
I do have one question on those, assuming that what you're pointing at is program areas.
Yeah.
If the concept moves forward and gains form about like what the chair had suggested about something like a block grant, and the door is still open for local submissions through that process, would those be separated as programs from more general programs? For example, like in public safety, communications, and the example that was being used, would that be a separate program from the more general safety and security program, or would it be subsumed into that as sort of a sub program? I'm not sure if that's clear what I'm asking.
Yeah, and I'm not close enough to how that works to know. I don't know if there's anyone else from the support team that's on the call that would be able to provide any better clarity around that.
So, John, I think I can, if there were, for example, the radio program, it would be my preference, and Matt Hansen, you please pipe up if I'm saying something that you don't agree with, but that is its own separate program, right? So that, these are the eligible entities that can apply. You could be funded up to X number of dollars, for example, and it would have its own rules as specific to that pot of, if, for example, the advisory panel suggested and, it moved through the process and let's say $1 million was approved, just to pick an even number, right? We would work within that to design a compatible program where, if you all wanted a match, we would make sure they had 25% match, for example, or, those kinds of things. It could be tiered as far as, I think the concern was raised earlier around smaller communities. It might be a harder investment for them. So maybe they would only have to come up with 10% match, or, something of that sort. So there are lots of things that we can do on the program design side once we get through that. But in my vision, it would be its own separate program, and there may be a few of those that exist, whether that be within state entities, at the statewide level, or if the advisory panel chose to suggest something that met a local need, for example. Matt, does that?
It does, exactly. The buckets you've been looking at so far are not grant programs per se. They're just aggregation of investment ideas. We would turn them into, individual programs. And even with the private entities, with the vendors, if they suggest an idea that you like, e-licensing or, interfaces for citizens to engage with the government, that could become a grant program where, individual, state agencies or entities would then go through a process to apply and ultimately have to go through a procurement process to select a vendor. So we're several steps away from actually, allocating funding and engaging entities on these projects.
So to be clear, is that an approach that this committee would suggest, or is that up to the main Spark committee to decide?
It would be a recommended approach that this advisory panel would provide to the executive committee for ultimate approval. But, I think it was Frank earlier asked about, obligations and expenditure periods, and, all those sorts of things would ultimately be in a formal application and an award document. And, so we would ensure that projects would, be able to obligate funds by December of 2024 and expend funds by 2026 and meet all the other, various requirements of this funding.
And just let the advisory panel know, I mean, this is kind of the way we set it up when we had the CARES Act money with the first Spark process. Obviously, we had a much constrained time frame because we had to have that money spent by December 30th, but everything was set up as grants. And so that they were administered either through the Office of Recovery or from other state departments. And so when I mentioned that idea, because we have a lot of localities that are submitting items in, we also have a lot of fire departments that are submitting our items in. So again, like for an example, we could set up a grant with the state fire marshal, and he could administer that to fire departments that apply to him. But this is a very similar process to what we did during the CARES Act money that came into the state.
Great. Thanks. Kind of moving forward, I'm going to try and get through the slides, and then we can kind of have a discussion at the end if we need to. Kind of the next steps really are, finalize that filtered list of programmatic areas. So as we talked about earlier, kind of continue with that filtering, and then start working on the programs themselves, using that template, through the support group to work with the advisory panel members who quote unquote volunteer to help provide guidance around some of those programmatic areas. And we're also going to continue to look for additional experts in any area required as we kind of answer any questions that the panel has, or just any questions that we need to answer as we're fleshing out the programs themselves. So the goal for the next session is to have a set of completed program templates so that the team can start kind of working through that. We can kind of, as a group, define, exactly what we want to do in terms of scoring, as well as, any areas in terms of the programs we want to kind of flesh out a little bit more. But getting to that point where we have completed the program template so that we know what we're scoring, and completed the scoring matrix so we know how we're going to score, so that the panel can start making some of those trade-offs around and identify the things that are rising to the kind of top of the value chain. Next slide. Talked about this a little bit. These are going to be the program templates that the support group is going to be working with panelists on. Once again, the support team is going to be doing kind of heavy lifting here and really engaging with the advisory panels. We all know, kind of day jobs are mainly around those discussions in the bottom left-hand corner with, go to the next slide, typically, we would be asking each panelist, questions like this. We may modify it a little bit going forward, but, how to begin thinking about each one of those programmatic areas, pros and cons, how do they meet the guiding principles? Are there any other questions around those areas that we really need to address to kind of close the loop on them?
And we'll have
yeah.
one of those templates for every submission.
Program. Not every submission. So there's not going to be 140 of them.
So if we're looking, if we're going through and vetting these 140 submissions and have questions about those, who do we address those questions to? And is there going to be a methodology where everybody sees those questions and that answer so we don't get a bunch of duplication?
About particular submissions?
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, I'd open it up to the support team. I mean, would we want to have any type of kind of comments fields or update fields attached to the submissions? Just so people can see kind of what
You're gonna violate COMA if you do that.
Okay, all right,
You can't have serial communications about.
got it. Okay.
But it could be a one-dimensional, we could submit the questions and you could then, you could put that out to all members. That's not a violation of COMA. If it goes out to everybody. And I see this.
The problem is that it does go out to everybody.
We're not approving specific ideas. That's not true. We have 140 submissions that have been put in front of us, and we're supposed to vet those down. While we're not approving them, we're approving them to move to the next level to go through the Spark committee.
Well, once again, we're gonna group them into programs, and some programs may have a project in it that's so big that effectively it looks like a project. But really, the prioritization is going to be at the programmatic level. So once again, I just want to be really clear. We're not going to have 140 detail templates. It's going to be something that's more along the order of 20 to 30 probably. Because even when you just look at the submissions, like on the radios, there are numerous submissions that are almost identical. That would fall into a program.
Oh, that part I understand, John, but there's a bunch of them that are fairly unique.
Yeah.
I guess I'm failing to get the picture of how we're going to not at some point in time talk about each one of these. Maybe we group some of them together like the radios, but there's a lot of them that are unique and individual approaches that I guess I don't understand how we're going to vet those.
Yeah, I mean, there are some where thematically they're the same, but it's like 3 big renovation projects, and do you bucket them under renovations and say, we need a total of 40 million for renovations, but really it's a total of 60 million, but it's 20 million projects, right? And you need to decide, am I going to ask for 60 or are only 2 of the projects valid, so I'm going to ask for 40? That's what you're getting at, right?
But I'm going to say okay, we're going to make a recommendation to Spark to put $20 million in a certain program.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's up to them to decide out of these submissions, which one they fund.
No, I think this group is going to need to at least have a point of view because it's going to need it to build the size, in some cases, the size of the ask for that program. It's going to have a point of view of, okay, 3 of the things are pretty similar, but we think 2 of them are more valid than the other one.
And-
so therefore, that's why we're going to size it this way.
Again, that circles back to my question is of vetting each of these submissions.
So if I could jump in here, as this process has evolved, there have been lots of evolutions of what this might contain. I think, originally it was only really program ideas. So something like the radios for the sheriff's offices, for example, and that would become a grant program that would then open, and those, sheriff's offices would be able to apply. Or for example, the state needs $50 million to deal with cybersecurity, but not that this committee would sit and say, well, we should do this cybersecurity project and this cybersecurity project, but not do this cybersecurity project because
I hear what you're saying, but that's not consistent with what I was told. And I guess I'd like for Chair Waymaster to weigh in on this, because if I'm off base, I'll shut up. But I don't believe that that's certainly not my understanding of what this committee's charge was to generalize at that level and ignore the individual merits of projects that were submitted.
No, then that'll happen. And so let me just kind of do an overall how the process is going to work. So we'll have these 140 submissions that have been made all throughout the state of Kansas. And this advisory panel will analyze every single submission. And then we will either say, yes, we need to fund that. Yes, we need to move forward. No, we don't. We don't want to move forward on this one. We want to set up a program for these because we have multiple applications. And then you and I, Mark, will go to before the Spark Executive Committee and sell the different programs and projects that our advisory panel decided that we would like to fund. The Spark Executive Committee is then going to meet, and they're going to have submissions from all the other advisory panels and going through the $731 million that we have remaining with the state from the ARPA funds. They will then go through all those and see which ones they want to fund, which ones they don't. And then the final approval then goes to the State Finance Council. And then if the State Finance Council approves it, then the money is dispersed. But yeah, this panel will make decisions on what we want to fund, what we want to create. And then you and I have to sell that to the Spark Executive Committee. And then they will then ultimately decide what goes to the State Finance Council.
Yeah, and that was my understanding of how this was supposed to work, but that wasn't what I was hearing from Alicia and John.
No.
Yeah, we can shape it how we need to shape it. We haven't kind of walked through the process yet, so we're gonna.
We're still in the beginning stages, and so it's going to modify as we go through the process. But at a 100-foot level, that's the process that we'll be following till the end.
And like I mentioned, I think some of the programs, just even to scale them, you'd need to understand the specific projects. Some of the projects are just so distinct.
And Representative Waymaster, if I could, I guess my concern here is when the submission form went out, it was not a call for applications for anything specific. If folks go back and look at the press release and things like that, it was supposed to be a general call for ideas, as opposed to like, please fund my nonprofit at $5 million. And so, that I think is a bit of a struggle, because some folks clearly did take that to heart and did that, while others said, I need, $200,000 for radios or things like that, where I think, at least the recovery office is aware that certain lobbyists, et cetera, probably got word out to their members pretty effectively. And those folks submitted, in bulk. So it appears that there's a big need out there while others didn't. And so, I just caution you that this was not a call for applications, but really a submission form for ideas. And that's the way that it was set up to be. And that was sort of the intention behind, what the recovery office and, the consultants and things like that did. So, I hear you, everybody wants to go through all of these, and I get that, but to your point previously about equity and things like that, I don't think that everyone was given the same opportunity to submit for, $100,000 for my specific entity. So.
Well, and I would totally agree with that, because the press releases that went out in regards for the applications or the submissions was very generic. I mean, it didn't give specificity of what we were going to be funding. Now, that's the decision that we're going to have to make on this advisory. And if there is a question about equity, then that's something that we're going to have to address. I mean, anytime that the state of Kansas is going to be having a grant program, you're going to have applications. And because everybody is going to be wanting to go after those dollars. Same thing happened when we had the CARES Act money and we did the small business grant with the Department of Commerce. They were overloaded in the first hour after that, and they couldn't even meet all the, there was no way we could meet the obligations because we had so many applications because it was a grant. So we were going to have, I'm not going to say we're going to go through every single submission, but we have to discuss the purpose of why they submitted it and give a decision as to why we're not going to fund it, if that's going to be the case.
Okay. Obviously, we just need to make sure that we're kind of connected on this after the session. And I know that it's going to kind of continue to evolve, and we're going to frame it in the right way to make sure that kind of we carry this out. We have all the details we need in order to be able to move in that direction. I guess any other kind of closing thoughts before we kind of make the pitch for the exit survey?
John, one thing that crossed my mind talking about filters in the funnel, and I don't know where this would be in this process, but fee-funded agencies versus state general fund agencies might be a little different. My example of that would be like Wildlife and Parks wanting to put in some bathroom facilities versus the Department of Corrections. And this is kind of, does this help the general good, or does it help the people who like to go to the park kind of thing? Just a thought. So
Okay.
I'm not saying both of them wouldn't get clear through the funnel, but depending on how many it's asked and where we're at, that might be an issue.
Okay. Got it. Anyone else?
I have a question about the considerations and the filtering. So we had sort of the scoring quadrants in one of the preparation documents, difficulty and impact.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. The scoring matrix. Yeah.
Is that something that will come later, or is that something we should be thinking about now?
As the templates get completed, it's going to have early views around some of how those things might score, or at least we'll have begun thinking about that, but it will come later. That will come in
Okay, thank you.
probably a cut at it between meetings 3 and 4 and a detailed discussion around it in meeting 4. Okay. Anything else? Well, thanks. I mean, like I said at the start, I appreciate that we laid so much information on people with such short notice with all the submissions. Literally, the support team only got to the finalized submissions like yesterday. And so I'd like to recognize too that the support team just had an incredibly heavy lift beginning to get us to the point now where we could kind of start pulling all of this together and have a framework around it to be able to move forward. So like I said, I think we've gone through kind of, this meeting was always set up to be kind of the messiest one, but hopefully it kind of gets us moving down the path in order to be able, for the panel, to be able to start, being able to make some decisions, some trade-offs against these as we continue to clarify them.
John, a comment I might make on scoring, if, when you put that form together,
Yeah.
if you can put things under different areas that kind of, for me to sit there and think of everything versus maybe some ideas that should be there, to where say, oh yeah, I forgot about that, and circle it. And then put our other kind of thing, that would help us save some time too. So
Okay.
I'm just saying, the more you can put on that,
Yeah,
that can help us, that direction would be helpful to me anyway.
got it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, on the scoring in particular, we're going to have to make sure that, given the complexity of all of that and all the moving pieces, anything that we can do to help the panelists make the scoring decisions, we'll do. Because once again, support team isn't going to be scoring anything. It's the panelists that's making that make all the decisions. So. Anything else? Any closing comments or thoughts? No? All right, great. Well, that's it. Appreciate the time. Thank you.